Thanks for listening. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one coaching with Dr. Lodhi, please visit drsadaf.com. I am an American board certified OBGYN, a mom, a Muslim, and I'm talking about sex. This is the Muslim Sex Podcast. Welcome to the Muslim Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sadaf Lodhi, and in this episode, we will be discussing everything you need to know about actually domestic violence today. So I am lucky enough to have on one of my bestest friends in the whole world, Shehnaz Khan, who is an attorney at law in San Jose, California. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today, Shehnaz, and you'll be giving our viewers some tips on what to look out for in terms of domestic violence. It's a topic that is definitely not discussed very often at all, and even less common, I think, in our communities. And I don't know if it's just something that, we don't want to discuss or something that we just try to ignore, but either way, it's a very, very important topic. And I'm so grateful that you're here and, you can kind of explain to our viewers what it looks like and in the different types of scenarios. But first, if you could just let our viewers, I know your awesomeness, but if you could just let our viewers know a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me, Sadaf. I, love your podcast, and I'm so glad to be able to be here and honored that, you asked me. So, and definitely to talk about a subject that's, very important and important to me in terms of the type of work I do. So I am a family law attorney in California, licensed to practice in California and in Michigan. I graduated a long time ago, probably over 20 years ago, from University of Michigan Law School. I've been practicing for probably about 16 or 17 years, took a lot of time off to be with my kids. I am a 40-hour trained domestic violence counselor, which means I've gone through the 40-hour trainings to be able to work with domestic violence victims. I have worked with local agencies here to represent victims of domestic violence in court hearings. I've done crisis lines at local domestic violence agencies, taking those phone calls, people calling in, seeking help. And I currently work at the local court here in a neutral fashion. So I'm not doing representation, but I do work for the court in a neutral manner. But I should clarify, I'm not here on behalf of the court. I am here as just a private attorney. So one of the services that our court has here in Santa Clara County in California is a restraining order help center. And it's one of the offices that I assist at, where we have people who coming in regarding questions about any kind of emergency domestic violence, civil harassment, whether they're the perpetrator, whether they're the victim, coming in asking for legal assistance. We don't represent them, but we do provide paperwork, answer questions, kind of give some guidance, things like that.
That's great. Thanks. So actually, I'd like to just get into the topic, if you don't mind. So if you could just, kind of just go over basically the definition, maybe the cycle of violence and the different forms of abuse.
Sure. And so with domestic violence, kind of one of the biggest misperceptions, and let me start off with this, is that domestic violence is not gender specific. It's not something that happens only to women by men, or only, men can be victims of domestic violence. People in same-sex relationships can have domestic violence in those relationships as well. Domestic violence can occur between a parent and child, a parent and between children to their parents, elder abuse, things like that. So there's all different types of forms of domestic violence. I'm going to speak primarily in referencing women when I speak of victims, and it's not to discount the experience of male victims, but rather it is what's reported is far more significantly occurrences that happen to women than to men. But again, men are victims of domestic violence as well. Domestic violence is not gender specific. is domestic violence. So it's, a lot of people think, oh, it's the punch in the face, it's the slam up against the wall, things like that, those physical acts. Domestic violence is essentially a power and control issue. It can take forms of physical violence, but it's not the only way that domestic violence is exhibited. So there are relationships where both parties are physically attacking each other and going at each other and throwing things and verbally abusing each other. And, a lot of times those are just dysfunctional relationships. Those are relationships where either party should probably be involved with one another, and it's just not going anywhere good anytime soon. So the issue here is to distinguish between something like that versus a power and control situation. And that's really where someone is using power to control somebody else. And that power can be physical power. It can be financial power. It can be emotional power. It can be verbal power, things like that. Anything that you're using to manipulate, to control another person. And so, like I said, a lot of times, majority of times this is happening in a male-female relationship, between where the male is a perpetrator, female is a victim. However, it is not exclusive in any sense to women as victims. Men have experienced this as well. And so, as I mentioned, there's different types. I mean, it can manifest in different ways. So again, the obvious ones are physical abuse, hitting, punching, slapping, choking, things like that. There's also emotional abuse, a lot of manipulation, the gaslighting, not that all gaslighting is a domestic violence incident, but it kind of raises red flags, like, oh, this doesn't look like a healthy thing that's happening in this relationship. So maybe it could be a gateway to something else. Verbal abuse, a lot of demeaning comments, putting somebody down, embarrassing them in front of other people, things like that. A lot of psychological abuse, again, the gaslighting, things like that. That kind of, it's not me, it's you, why did you do these things? If you were just acting in a certain way, I wouldn't get so angry, things like that. Some of the more concerning aspects of domestic violence can be things like stalking and harassment. And from a legal perspective, they are more difficult to prove because they have an intention behind them. So if somebody comes in and has a black eye, there's some obvious physical evidence that, somebody's been harmed or hurt in a situation. But if somebody's being harassed or stalked, how do you show that is actually happening? One, it's not just in this person's mind, oh, they're being paranoid. And two, how do you know that the action is not an innocent action? Hey, I'm just driving by your house. I have to go to the store and I have to pass your house. But rather they're passing in front of your house 20 times a day, or they're sending their friends to pass in front of your house 20 times a day, stuff like that. So stalking and harassment are definitely concerning. In California, we've now also included a term called disturbing the peace. So actions that are not categorized in these very specific boxes of physical violence or, they did this, they did that, but rather a general sense of, I'm just there to kind of disrupt you and harass you to the point that you do what I need you to do. I'm going to use this disturbing your peace element. So yeah, it can manifest in many ways, but the essence of it is a power and control in the relationship. It's not an equal relationship, and it's not a relationship where, some of the terms that you'll hear, probably might be easier. Some of the terms that you'll hear from people who are experiencing domestic violence is, I always feel like I'm walking on eggshells. I try to do this right, but they get really angry again. So I try to do it better this way. Like nothing I do is good enough. I'll do it the way they told me to do it this time, but it still made them really angry. That kind of sense of taking on that responsibility. If I just fix this one thing, they will behave in a better way. Like you're responsible for their reaction, for their behavior. So sometimes when you start hearing those kind of terms from somebody, again, as a domestic violence advocate or a counselor who works with people, those are the things that start raising some red flags. Like, why do you feel like you have to be careful? Obviously you should be considerate of other people. Again, all this in the context of a normal relationship has, certain actions that, are, of course, you should always be considerate of another person. But in a domestic violence relationship, these are taken to the extreme. So.
So interesting. So I don't know. I'm wondering if you can also speak about the difference between the legal, the general, and say like the Islamic definitions.
Sure. So sometimes what happens is somebody might be experiencing domestic violence, and it is a domestic violence relationship or an incident, things like that, as defined maybe by your therapist or by your doctor or somebody that you're encountering a domestic violence agency. But then you go to file a restraining order or take action in a legal sense. And wait a minute, you don't have enough information, or what you're describing, the court might say, doesn't rise to the level of getting protection. Or you go to the police and they're like, no, we can't do anything about that. And in that sense, it's not that you're not experiencing domestic violence or that these aren't incidences of domestic violence, but rather what has been codified, or what actions can be taken in a legal sense are not necessarily caught up with what is the actual definition of a domestic violence incident. And so sometimes people experience some discrepancy in that. So they will be told, yes, you're kind of in a domestic violence relationship or something like that, but they try to do something about it, or they call the police, and the police might be saying, well, we can't really do anything with this. We can't arrest them for that or that. And then it sends a lot of confusion. People feel a little bit hopeless, like, well, if I can't do anything about it. And it's not necessarily that. It's really that at those moments, it might be better to talk to a private attorney to get, or an domestic violence agency, to see how best to put it in legal terms, or what the court is looking for, so you can present your case in that best way. If for most restraining orders, and that would be the legal ramification of one of the legal ramifications, if you're going to call the police or ask for domestic violence restraining order, ask for help regarding domestic violence incidences, is you can ask for a restraining order. And, essentially what the court is looking for is to see, are you fearful for your safety? And if you are fearful for your safety, then how do you express that? How do you put that out there to explain, here's why I'm so scared? I'm scared he's going to take the kids. I'm scared he's going to, send me back home, to my family. I'm scared that he's not going to let me, go out in the evening, things like that. Not necessarily, those might be descriptions of incidences of domestic violence acts, but are you scared for your safety? And if you are, why? Why are you scared? And being able to describe that in a legal sense, that will push you into that legal realm. But it doesn't mean that what you're experiencing is not domestic violence. As far as Islamically, there's not really a Islamic domestic violence term. That's definitely a modern term. And, there's always this issue of being able to take these modern concepts and terms and immediately apply it to Islam and say, well, what does Islam say about domestic violence? Well, there's no domestic violence term in Islam. But there are general ideas about caring for other people, about how a relationship should happen, what kind of love and care should happen within a relationship, and acceptable acts between husbands and wives, or in relationships between children and parents, and between adults and their parents, things like that. So I think as Muslims, we should probably look at those hadith and those Quranic ayahs as descriptions of how those relationships, in a positive light should be seen, rather than looking specifically for a term of domestic violence.
Do you think that it's because, I'm sure I'm sure it probably happened at that time as well, say like 1400 years ago when Islam came about. But I wonder why, like I wonder why, or maybe they had a different term, or, maybe it wasn't a problem, or maybe there was a respect for women that came about once Islam came, because it's interesting that, a lot of people don't know that much about Islam and don't realize that Islam actually gives women a lot of rights, right? And a lot of protections. And I'm just interested in finding out that maybe at that time, or maybe this wasn't such an issue because once Islam came about, women's, status, because we know that with the pagan Arabs, women were seen more as property and, as such. And so once Islam came about, they were kind of seen as their own person and they were able to, work and have their own business. They were business women and, they're very sophisticated women, and Islam gave women a lot of rights. I just wonder, um, why there isn't such a term, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I suppose I should have done this earlier, but preface this by saying I am in no way an Islamic scholar. So, I mean,
Oh, of
for
course.
a for a proper discussion, what Islam, says on specifically, what the rights of women are in this relationship, in marriage, in relationships, I think, definitely you should look to the scholars. You should talk to your imam, things like that. But as far as, as a family law attorney, people do come and ask, and especially Muslim women wanting to know, well, what does Islam say? People don't want to, their Islam is very important to them. They want to make sure what they're doing is okay. I think what comes about, and I don't think that it's not there or it went away. I think that it's the potential for it to be, I'm trying to think. I think when Islam came and provided rights for women in relationship and said to families, to men, to women, here are the obligations you have to your family, to your spouse, to your children, to your parents. Here is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, the goal Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is getting to, is a peaceful home, a home where a husband and wife are garments for one another, where there is a head of a household, right? So in that sense, it is a little different than the traditional, Western view of a marriage, but it doesn't mean that gives one person in the relationship the ability to take advantage of that position, right? And I think the elephant in the room when it comes to talking about domestic violence and Islam is the ayat in the Quran that talks about, that beat them lightly, the permission that comes. So that if there's a disagreement between men and women, between husband and wife, that they are to, that there's various ways in which they can look for resolving those issues. But one of them, first, separate yourselves from them, etc. And then finally you may beat them lightly, was always a controversial ayah, and how to interpret it and what does it mean and why is it there, and does it allow for violence in the home, things like that. And I think most scholars that you will find today will say that, no, it's not a blank check for, yes, go out and harm your spouse or use fear and anger to resolve your conflict. There's far more ayahs and hadith and the actions of the Prophet, sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that show compassion and kindness and peace in the home. And I keep going back to the item of peace in the home, because if you can't be yourself, if you can't have a conversation with your spouse, if you are constantly walking on eggshells, that's not a peaceful home for you or for your children. And I think as Muslims, as Muslim women, men and women, I think we need to remember that the point of having stable families is to have a peaceful home for comfort, for your spouse, for your children. It's a place of comfort. And if you can't point to your household and say that, then maybe something's not quite right, and that you should start looking a little deeper into some of those issues. So I would say I can't get too much into that issue about, the chronic ayah or the, whys or, the history of it. But I think we just should be aware that it's there. I think it is an ayat that affects a lot of relationships, Muslim relationships, good and bad. And I think if there's additional issues or questions with it, that it's probably best to seek guidance from a scholar on that, looking specifically into that issue. But as far as the practical application, whether it's in the Quran or not, acts of violence have effects on people and they have effects on families. And that's kind of what our job is here, is to address the practical application of how domestic violence affects families. How do we keep families safe? How do we stop extreme behavior from happening? And how do we teach people to have healthier relationships?
Absolutely. So, I'm glad you went over all of that, and definitely, the ayah, which of course in my podcast I always preface with, if there's any questions about your religion, to definitely seek out the advice of a religious scholar. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and absolutely, this podcast definitely does not give out any fatwas at all by any means. It's merely a discussion. So it's very important, if people have any questions at all, to feel free to, ask your imam and do your own due diligence and research. So I do want to know a little bit about, when we talk about domestic violence and we talk about the victim, oftentimes people are like, well, why can't they just get up and leave? Or, they think that it may never happen to them, or, they may even say, well, maybe she deserved it. Or did you see the way she was acting? Maybe that's why, X, Y, and Z happened. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. So, part of the issue with domestic violence is there's a whole psychology of it. There's a whole psychology of the domestic violence victim. And when you encounter somebody who's experiencing domestic violence, or if you are somebody who's going through domestic violence, it is really important that you get involved with people who have experience working with such victims. That's why with domestic violence agencies, you can't just walk in the door and say, I want to volunteer, I want to help out. You have to go through a training. You have to go through a 40-hour training to be able to interact with domestic violence victims, because there is a whole psychology behind it. There are aspects to domestic violence and to what the victims have been through that does affect how they interact, how they respond to things. So yeah, why can't they just leave? Well, because that's part of the domestic violence. Part of what the perpetrator is doing is creating a worldview for their victim, very, very subtly, over time. It might be reinforced unwittingly by other external experiences, that I'm your whole world. I'm everything. If you leave, who's going to help you? Who's going to pay your bills? You think your family's going to take you back? What's the community going to say? Who's going to believe you? A lot of times in those relationships, isolation is one of the elements that you look for when somebody's talking to you about domestic violence, or when they're describing their situation. If you hear that they're becoming very isolated, they're not talking to their friends, they're not in communication with their family as much anymore, they're not going out. Maybe somebody used to go out all the time and now they're not, or they're only going out with the perpetrator, with their spouse all the time. I can only go to the grocery store with them. I have to check in all the time. Their spouse is constantly calling them while they're out. Again, these individual incidences alone don't say, oh, I'm in a domestic violence relationship. If your husband's calling you and you're out for dinner, it doesn't mean, oh my God, he's so controlling. But if he's calling 5 or 6 times during the dinner, and this is the first time you've gone out in a long time, or something, and there's not a reason really behind it, then it just raises, again, those red flags. So isolation becomes one of the elements, or that, kind of abuses that happens to a victim. Financial control, where they're only given a little bit of money. They're made to feel like they don't have access to anything. They have to run everything through the spouse. No, again, a lot of regular, healthy relationships have where you're in a financial relationship with somebody. So of course you're going to run the finances by. You're not going to go buy a brand new car without telling your spouse, got to make sure you got money to pay for stuff. That's different. This is, here's the amount of money that you have. What did you do with it? What's going on? Account for me, every single thing you're doing. Extreme behavior in regards to that, where somebody feels like they don't have the ability to go out and buy a bus ticket. They don't have anybody that they can talk to about things. We, have heard incidences where people sometimes will get other friends or family member to check in on this person, their spouse, for them. So it's not just the perpetrator calling them during the day, but other family members. What are you doing? Where are you going? Who are you going with? Things like that. So it's this feeling of being watched. A lot of times you'll hear domestic violence victims sometimes coming off sounding a little bit paranoid. So when you're talking to them, you're like, oh, I don't think anybody's following you. But those are all the things that the perpetrators made them. That's the worldview they've created for them, that I'm everything that you have. If you leave me, what's going to happen to you? So they create that extremely dependent person. So statistically, it takes up to seven attempts before somebody will actually leave a relationship. And we've seen this even amongst some of the most famous superstars. One of the most recent famous examples was of Rihanna and Chris Brown, right? She had, she'd been punched in the face and had physical harm and trauma to her, and she went back, for a little while. She left eventually, but she went back initially. So, understanding the victim is really important, and understanding that it is a psychology. It is something that's been created by the perpetrator to help them, to make the victim feel completely helpless. And, there's definitely other barriers to leaving. It's not just, I'm going to pick up and go, but where am I going to go? I have children with this person, he won't let me take the children. What am I going to do with my kid? Where can I go with my 2 kids, with my 3 kids? How am I going to pay for anything? I don't have a bank account. I don't have a credit card. I don't know anybody here. I don't speak the language. I know a little bit of English, but I don't know enough English to communicate everything that's going on for me, And then as far as community goes, in the Muslim community, it's, it's the social status, right? So much of our community puts so much emphasis on social status, going out there and having to seek help is going to mean that I'm not going to be able to interact in certain groups. And this is, again, just the reality. Whether it's right or wrong is not the question here, but this is a reality that victims are facing. And so a lot of times, given some of those choices, they choose to stay, or they don't know any other route sometimes. And then one last thing, just before, the other thing to understand about a victim of domestic violence is a lot of times they're not looking to leave. They just want the perpetrator to stop doing what they're doing. They like them, they love them, they want to be with them. They just don't do that. Don't come after me. Don't hurt me. Don't control me. So a lot of times it's that, hey, but if they would just stop doing X, Y, Z, I feel like everything would be okay. And so they keep waiting for that moment. And I know we kind of went over this. You had mentioned it earlier, and I don't think I went over it, was the cycle of violence. And I if it's okay, can I bring that up now? So,
of course.
Yeah. So, and I think you can get these online. If you just type up domestic violence, cycle of violence. So a cycle of violence essentially is, it's a wheel, and essentially it's what happens in a domestic violence relationship, in that there's a period of time where there's tension building. So things are, there's tension building in the house. Things are getting stressful. People are getting, the abusers may be getting a little nitpicky, or little bursts of, complaints, or, moodiness or whatever, tensions building. You can tell, oh, this person's not in a good mood, or, oh boy, I better just stay out of their way or something. And then boom, something happens and there's an explosion. There's an incident. There's an action or something happens. And then there's what's called the honeymoon period. And the honeymoon period is, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I can't believe I did that. I should never have gotten so angry. Here's the flowers. I love you so much. Let's go on a trip. Anything to make up for whatever has been done. Being intimate, using, physical relationship to say, oh my gosh, I can't live without you. I can't believe I did that. And all that stuff, whatever needs to be said. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. And then you go back into, time goes on, and then, oh, another incident. Oh, the tension's building. I can feel it again. And oh my gosh, they're in a bad mood again. No, I better not say this. I better just avoid this. Oh, kids, come on over here. Just stay away. And let's just do it like this, is make him happy or her happy, And then boom, there's an explosion. Something happens, triggers it. There's, an incident, physical incident, yelling incident, whatever, something happens. And then, oh my gosh, the honeymoon period again. Oh my God, I can't believe it happened again. I swear to God, it won't happen again, with the flowers. So the honeymoon phase. So this is the cycle. And what happens over time is that the tension building gets longer or, shorter, meaning you're living more in this tension part of the circle. And the honeymoon phase starts to get shorter and shorter. So the time between incident and tension starts to go almost cyclical. So the honeymoon phase starts to get shorter and shorter until it's gone, until it's just tension and explosion, tension and explosion. And so it's essentially, the progression of a cycle of violence. And so why do people stay? Because maybe that honeymoon period, things are really great and they're a really great person. And if they could just be this person, everything would be all right. So they're willing to put up with the other stuff if I can get to that. But what happens in a domestic violence relationship, and it's hard for the victim to see this, is eventually, over time, if things are not addressed, that honeymoon phase is going to get shorter and shorter. Those explosions are going to get worse and worse, and that tension is going to eventually be the predominant time you're spending in the relationship. So what we have to do as a community be careful of is the victim blaming.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And unfortunately, sometimes it comes from our own family. Oh, beta, just do this and everything will be okay. Just do that. Don't make them like this. Don't get them like that. Or they're tired when they come home from work or something of that nature. And again, in a normal, healthy relationship, yes, be considerate. Take care of your spouse. Your spouse takes care of you. But in a domestic violence relationship where there's power and control, there's this false pressure or sense that somehow as the victim, I have control over their reaction and their abuse on me. That if I just do X, they will stop hurting me, hitting me, controlling me. If I just do it perfectly, if I just do it right. But you don't have control over another person's emotions. They have control over their emotions. You don't have control over their reactions. They have control over their reactions. So we have to be careful not to blame the victim for the reactions of somebody else. They can control themselves. Absolutely. They can't control how somebody else is going to react to them.
Absolutely. I see that, and I definitely, recognize that in our communities that there is oftentimes, blaming of the victim, oh, well, did you see how she is? Oh, well, she's so loud, or maybe that, who knows, maybe she did something that made him mad or something like that, right? Instead of actually blaming the perpetrator who's causing all this harm to the family, right? In the family environment.
Right. And as part of that victim blaming is if you do anything about it, you're the one as the victim breaking up the family. Oh, why are you,
right.
You're breaking up the family. Why are you leaving? Why are you taking the kids away? Why are you don't, he's such a great person. And again, I don't mean to be specific in the genders in my conversation to discount the experience of male victims. I have actually represented men male victims. So they are there, and they should also be given a voice, simply for conversational sake, using the gender specific of she versus he. But
Sure.
yeah, it's the blaming also of breaking up the family. Oh, that somehow the victim has control over, whether they are breaking up a family or not. What we have to understand is the minute somebody creates a violent home, they've broken up the family already. That is the action that's breaking up the family. That is not in line with the Sunnah of the Prophet. That is not in line with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's want for family, that there be peace, that there be comfort, that it be a place where you go and feel comfortable, right? So when there's violence in the home, and there's yelling, there's screaming, and there's hitting, and there's control, that's not a peaceful place. So the breakup of the family happened already. What the victim is doing is keeping the family safe, keeping themselves safe. And as a victim, one of the things I think you need to realize, and I suppose I don't know who's listening who needs to hear this, is if you have children especially, but the most important thing is that you stay safe, that whatever happens, that you get the help and you stay safe. Everything else will fall into place and be okay. But if you're not in a safe situation, you need to stay safe. If you have children, for at least the sake of your children, you should definitely do it for yourself. But if you can't bring yourself to do it for yourself, then at least for the sake of your children, they need their parent, they need their mom, they need their dad, they need their parent alive and safe.
I'm going to just take a pause right here because I want us to continue in the next episode of this podcast. So stay tuned. So we are done here, and it's been real and really intimate. And listen to the second episode of Domestic Violence Continued with Shehnaz Khan. And that will be the next episode. But remember, this is not meant to be any type of medical, and actually in this episode, legal advice. So if you are having any issues with domestic violence, or you're worried about your safety, please contact your, legal advocates and or police so that they may help you and to help you find a situation where you find yourself to be safe and free from harm. Until next time, this is a Muslim Sex Podcast. So make sure that you listen to the next episode because we will be continuing this conversation with Shehnaz Khan and discussing a little bit more on victim blaming and the effect on victims, long and short term. So thank you. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one coaching with Dr. Lodhi, please visit drsadaf.com. And until next time, this is the Muslim Sex Podcast.